Hey, good morning, and thank you for inviting me to speak about a subject I'm passionate about, restoring fish migrations, especially on large Atlantic rivers. And I love to show this image because it's not an accident that in this early lithograph from the Hudson, the three species that are featured are all diadromous. These are the fish that colonists relied on that brought the riches of the sea back in a very predictable way to river systems all down the coast. And my theme for this is using a quote from a very wise person that we can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. I think we have to think about this problem in new ways, and I want to offer some ideas, and I'd be very interested in your feedback. So this is the Atlantic assemblage of diadromous fish, and what's interesting about these species is that there are about a dozen of them, and they're phylogenetically very diverse, all the way from the so-called primitive sea lamprey to the highly derived striped bass. So this life history form has evolved many times among disparate groups, and it's a rare form of life history in the world of fishes. There are over 20,000 fish species in the world, and less than 1% are diadromous, but those that are, those that choose this very sort of complicated life history pattern often flourish if they're allowed to. And I circled the American shad here, and also the river herring, because I think that the contrast between them is interesting in that they kind of explain where we stand today in terms of restoration of large rivers and small rivers. So I'll talk about that. And in working on my book, Running Silver, I was very interested in the accounts of early colonists and what they saw. And I have gathered many, many accounts, but I'm just going to show you three of them that I liked a lot. One was from 1634. Alewives come up to the fresh rivers and spawn in such multitudes. It is almost incredible, pressing up such shallow waters that will scarce permit them to swim. Another one that the abundance, the abundance is incredible. And my all-time favorite, I call it a festival of superlatives, in a word that is unbelievable, indeed undescribable, and is also incomprehensible. What quantity is found there, one must behold oneself. I don't know how many fish were there, but there were a hell of a lot. There were a hell of a lot. This points to the importance of historical ecology, that we need to go back to these qualitative accounts too, and just not rely on much more recent numbers. So compare those accounts with status river herring today, which Adrian did a terrific job on. And river herring are in the dark blue here. And this is just from 1950 to recent years, and you see this staggering decline. And if you look state by state, this is a species that was likened to passenger pigeons when the colonists came here. Now we have total or partial closures in a number of states. This is the famous herring run on the Cape Cod Canal, where anglers would catch alewives and drift them out for large striped bass. Now you can't touch a river herring there. We've sank a long way. But I'm actually optimistic on river herring because fish ladders tend to work for river herring. Dam removals is still the best solution of all, but a river herring is pre-adapted to a fish ladder. These are river herring charging up a natural chute in a brook, and this is a fish ladder, and they're not very different. So I'm not really as pessimistic about the future of river herring because I think fish ladders are working reasonably well. So we have two solutions that can work, removal and fish ladders. But the same is not true for American shad. American shad have lost access to about 40% of their historic range, and their populations are way down compared to original numbers. And frankly, if you could get American shad to where they need to spawn, you would get all the other diadromous fish coming in too, because these are big fish that have to get very far upriver. If they make it, everything else is coming too. So shad are a good species to actually look at in terms of restoration plans and evaluating success. And a few years ago, Karen Lindberg and I sat down and went through a whole lot of data for both the North American Atlantic coast and the European coast on diadromous fish, and published a paper in Bioscience that looked at their status, where we took estimates of population size and catches and standardized them and looked at the trends. And the trends are basically this in almost every system, just way down. And in many cases, you don't get extirpation. You get some kind of resilience kicking in at the level of what I call a relic stock. Either that or we're all going to crash at the same time, and it hasn't happened yet, but I don't think that's the case. The one exception is the striped bass, where we had a single driver overfishing, and we corrected that, and we got a nice recovery. But the numbers were really, really depressing, and the patterns are all the same. And this was a good encapsulation of the status of these fish. And just to give you a couple of case histories, you kind of know these stories to begin with, but if you look at Atlantic salmon in American waters, not Canadian waters, it's estimated that there were about 300,000 to 500,000 fish all the way from northern Maine to the Housatonic River in Connecticut. And a friend of mine at the Atlantic Salmon Federation thinks those numbers are low. It was more than 500,000. In 2016, there were 580, and they're federally endangered in the Gulf of Maine rivers. So salmon are in trouble. But a really incredible case history is Susquehanna River shad, which is fitting given that we are just hundreds of yards away from the source of the Susquehanna here. And shad in the good old days would migrate from the ocean, migrate from the ocean all the way up to the west branch of the Susquehanna to Lock Haven, and all the way 500 miles almost to Lake Otsego, which is a remarkable run. And along that way, they were fished very heavily. They helped sustain early colonists. They were a big part of the celebration of spring with major shad bakes. There were huge catches made. There was even an account, there were several interesting accounts about this run, but one of them was that at one fishery they would actually put a person up on a hill with a spyglass, and he would watch for when the water would bulge as the shads came up the river. It would actually change and get higher and show evidence of these huge schools, which is something we haven't seen for a heck of a long time. So what's happened to these fish? Well, there were 4 dams built in the lower Susquehanna, beginning with Oconowingo, which is just 10 miles from the mouth of the river. And these crippled this run, which I think is now probably 5 orders of magnitude less than what it used to be. The goal is to pass 2 million fish past the York Haven Dam, the 4th dam in a row here, to get to the historical spawning grounds. One of the corollaries of having hydro dams is you actually get to count every fish. That's one of the little benefits you get in terms of the fish wall. So we know that, for instance, in 2014, about 10,000 shad passed Conowingo. Of those, about a quarter made it past the 2nd dam. Of those, about half made it past the 3rd dam, and 8 fish made it past the York Haven Dam. Try to imagine the river bulging from 8 fish coming up the Susquehanna. And this is not atypical. There was a year that recently there was 0. Other years are 100 or 200. And what they're doing with these dams is they're tweaking them in little ways to fish passage. So maybe they'll get 300 instead of 400, but 400 instead of 200. But the problem is that we're not seeing the orders of magnitude recoveries we need to actually have a meaningful restoration. And this brings up to mind the shifting baselines issue, the idea that we have forgotten what was there originally, and we changed our objectives in light of rather minimal recent sizes rather than the original sizes that occurred. And one really great example is if you look at the shad landings for the Potomac River from 1887 to a little past 2000, and you see a decline that is nothing to be proud of. It's an awful decline. But what if you go further back in time? What if you dig deeper and look at data from an earlier period? Here's 1887 versus 1814. If you didn't know about this, you would think this is your baseline. This baseline has shifted incredibly far. And this is typical for a lot of rivers. If you say a river has incredible numbers of fish from the old days, you don't have a number, but you should at least keep in the back of your mind that there was probably a hell of a lot of fish compared to what we're seeing. So what can be done about this? I like to think about the ways that we can actually make changes in terms of drivers. And I categorize them in a number of ways. One of them, I think, is largely rectified. Pollution is not stopping or really hurting our restoration efforts these days. It never was the big driver anyway, but we've done a good job since the Clean Water Act, and the waters are not pristine, but they're not stopping these fish from proliferating. Then we have drivers that are tractable and already mostly applied. Overfishing, I know it's not perfect, but the ASNFC does a reasonably good job about controlling fishing these days. They get blasted for when they miss their mark, but overall, we have really kind of reined in overfishing to a large degree. Power plants were and are a big issue on some systems like the Delaware and the Hudson. we have as many protective devices as we can have on them, and the worst of them are going to be probably aged out and will go to closed cycle cooling in the future. So I don't think that'll be a large driver. Then we have drivers that are essentially untractable. So we have non-native species. I think this is a really underappreciated factor. You know, these fish migrate into the headwaters of these streams, making these energetically costing runs, we think because it's a good place to leave an egg, where you won't have a lot of predators and where the young fish can drift into a rich estuary to get larger. Nowadays, we have a gauntlet of non-native species these fish have to pass through. And I think that's kind of a much larger issue than people realize. And then we have climate. It's very well documented that the ranges and the phenologies of these fish are shifting. It's theoretically reversible, but if you think it's going to turn around soon, I'd love to hear your argument for that. And then we finally have something that's tractable, but still unrectified. And you can guess what that is. Dams. This is the famous Conewago that I was picking on in the Susquehanna River. This is an environmental atrocity. It actually is 90% filled with sediment right now. And it has ruined the fish run, and it's changed the sediment dynamics of the system, and they're expecting a hurricane at some point to blow out that sediment. They call it the apocalypse when it's going to happen. And it's going to change and cause all kinds of problems with the restoration of Chesapeake Bay. And this is just one of the 4 dams in that system, and it's typical of dams all over the East Coast. So how do fish pass dams? Well, you know, just very quickly, they use ladders and they use elevators. Neither of these terms belongs with the word fish. These are human terms. We should not be putting fish through ladders or elevators. But this is what we use. And when you see these fishways, these engineered fishways on a dam, you know, it looks like it's mitigated, but it's not, because they don't work very well. And I'll demonstrate that with a paper that actually Karin and Adrian were co-authors on, led by Jed Brown, where we looked at empirical data of the success of fish ladders on 3 major northeastern rivers, the Merrimack, the Connecticut, and the Susquehanna. And when you look at the number of fish passed as a percent of target, it's nothing to be happy about. And I should add that the targets are not ambitious compared to the original run sizes. They're a whole lot lower. Nevertheless, the Connecticut stays roughly about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5%. Susquehanna basically flat lines. And the Merrimack had this odd, good year and then crashed. So we're not doing well in that regard. But more interesting to me is passage efficiencies. Passage efficiencies are interesting because this is looking now at how many pass the first dam and then get to the next dam or the final dam and pass it. And the beauty of that is that once you count them in the first dam, you can't blame poor run sizes on vague ocean factors that you could hypothesize but really can't actually do anything with. Here you have them already trapped in the system, so now you're looking at the actual passage efficiency. And when you look at that, you see that for what really matters here, the first to the last dam in red, this is the Merrimack, this is the Connecticut, and this is the Susquehanna. It's frankly pathetic in terms of its effectiveness. I mean, I'll be blunt about it. So what needs to be done? We ultimately need to free these rivers in space and time. This is, you know, my theoretical healthy river, and these are actual engineering diagrams of the dams on some 2 large main rivers. They look like railroad tracks. And, you know, obviously fish have tremendous problems getting up these systems. In a healthy river, the fish will come over the course of several months. They'll utilize the entire river. You may have different life history variants that come at different times and use different areas, which gives you a life history diversity that provides abundance and resilience. The fish also can leave easily and come back again and spawn a second and third, maybe 4th time. In this situation, where you have awful passage and no passage, you get the fish contracting in space and time, which gives you that relic run, but it gives you none of this abundance and resilience. It's kind of like just a last gasp way of surviving. So the very best tool is dam removal, and I, in my book, said that every dam should have an existential crisis. And what I mean by that, and I'd like that to be a T-shirt that American Rivers would sell, but so far they haven't gone for that idea. We should be wearing those. The idea is that we should be looking at every dam and asking the question, does this dam deserve to survive longer, or should it be taken down? And I think in so many cases they exist through just societal inertia. There are so many that are ripe for the plucking. Luckily, there is a growing dam removal movement in this country. And we're seeing an increase, although not so much on large dams. There have been a few large dams taken down, but we need to make a lot more progress on that front. Okay. So the Great Atlantic Coast precedent occurred on the Kennebec River, where FERC actually agreed to let the Edwards Dam come down. This was in 1999. John McPhee in The Founding Fish has a great account of that whole situation. And it was a large dam that blocked a lot of the river, but it produced an extremely small amount of power. Its nameplate capacity was 3.5 megawatts, which is nothing. So it was removed without energy replacement. And it happened on July 1st, 99. And it opened up the Sebastopol River for the first time in 160 years, a tributary that is like alewife Shangri-La. And within a few years, that run went from 0, because they couldn't get there, to 3 million alone in that one system. And the pattern is that dam removals almost always result in almost instant recoveries. Interesting too about hydropower, Karin did an analysis with our class of the hydropower produced by the Conowingo Dam. And its nameplate capacity is 548 megawatts. And to me, who was naive about power details before I got into this world, I thought that's what it produced on a daily basis. Turns out that its actual generation is way under even half of that most of the time. It bounces back and forth depending on water flow and need and maintenance, but it's way less than we think. So it's actually not as large a lift to replace it if you're concerned about replacing the energy. And that's typical of most hydro dams. The nameplate capacity does not meet the actual production for various reasons. So in thinking about this issue, actually Karin and I got riled up about the FERC licensing of the Conowingo Dam, and we wrote a op-ed in the New York Times called "Let the River Run Wild." And in talking about that, we thought about the idea of replacing that power using solar. And that led to a whole new world of research for me, and Karin too, about how we might do that. So we published another essay in E360 where we presented the idea of what we call the shared river concept. And the idea of the shared river concept is that it's theoretically possible to share a river between energy production and actual meaningful ecological fish restoration rather than the cosmetic form that we have today. And this is the status quo. You have a reservoir, you have a dam, you have transmission lines, you have fish that get to it, a few of them make it in, maybe they don't, but it's not working for the fish. What you could do though is if you were to breach the dam, is you could get back a lot of land area. You could put hydrokinetic type turbines in the flow and capture some of the water flow. You also can capture some of the water flow using diversionary hydro, but you're not blocking the river. You're also working with the existing transmission lines. This is a very expensive part of any project, building transmission lines, but they're there already because they're taking the hydropower away. Then you could think about using that real estate you get back for solar arrays. And, you know, in some systems you could have a lot of solar on the reservoir bottom and even have floating solar in some places. And then finally, because reservoirs occur in valleys, in some locations you probably could have wind power around the edges. And you know, in an idealized conception of this, you would end up with an energy park that probably produces a lot more power than the hydro, because hydropower is not a really rich source of power. If you look at the details of when water falls, how much energy it provides, it's not a lot. And you also would have more resilience, because you'd be drawing from several sources at once, rather than just from water flow. So we like this concept, and we're promoting it as something that ought to be tried somewhere, but there are some caveats. One of them is that when I did a little tour of some northeastern rivers last September, Merrimack and Connecticut in particular, and looked at some of the dams, which look very tired at this stage of their lives. River valleys in the northeast typically are kind of narrow and have run-of-the-river type hydropower, which means that you would not get back a lot of real estate if you remove the dams. You get back a functioning river, but you wouldn't get back all that land like you would in a big western reservoir that might have a lot of storage capacity. So we've been thinking more about the idea of near-site remediation, where you have power produced near the removal, but not right in the reservoir bottom. But I've been working with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Colorado on some bigger issue items, and they have great data analytics. And we asked them for some particular analyses that turned out to be, I think, really interesting. So I just want to point out some of the key data. This is State by state, number of hydro dams range from 1 in Kansas to 339 in California. New York is actually a hydropower powerhouse, to use a bad pun, because of Niagara. And it has a lot of hydro dams, 279. It's not that far behind California. We also looked at the actual generation in gigawatt hours per year by state, and the total is here, about 275,000. And also the total reservoir area in acres behind all these dams, state by state, and in total it's almost 10 million acres. Another output here is looking at the amount of land needed in solar to be equivalent to the current hydro output by state. So we're looking state by state, how much hydro and then how much solar area you would need to compensate for that. And we have a total here. And then we also looked at the amount of electricity that could be generated if all hydro dams were removed. And I mean, every hydro dam in the country was removed, and 50% of the reservoir bottom was used for solar. So when we actually started to dig deeper into these numbers, what we found was that you need about 1.3 million acres to replace every single hydropower dam in this country. Now, that's a vague number. What does that mean to you? Well, I'll tell you that it's the size of Delaware. So if you cut up Delaware and put solar in, in the west, you'd have a lot of land to work with. In the east, maybe you could use brownfields and landfills and other sites. You could get rid of every single hydro dam in this country. And that's less than 0.1% of the lower 48 land area. Solar could also replace the energy from all hydro dams while requiring only 13% of their existing reservoir surface area. So from the point of view of land efficiency, by drowning land with water for hydro, it's actually extremely inefficient compared to replacing it with solar. And this is with solar today. Solar keeps advancing year by year. Another contrast, if all hydro dams were removed and 50% of emerging land was used for solar, we would have 4 times the amount of electricity that could be generated by current hydro. So we're not using this area efficiently. Although I understand reservoirs have many other uses besides hydro. Certainly get that. For an example, Florida could replace its 4 hydro dams, which some of them are rather controversial, with solar area equal to Central Park, which is 843 acres, or a tiny, tiny percentage of total state land area. An 11-fold increase in solar would compensate for removal of all 339 hydro dams in California. And in New York, if hydro would pass it, well, if you exclude Niagara Falls, because it's never going to pass a fish, eagles do try to climb it, but they don't get very far. If you worry about everything else, you would need about 63,000 acres to replace the other 278 hydro dams. Now, an acre is not that big a piece of land, and this to me is a mental calibration of the value of hydro and the kind of geographical, spatial cost it would be to replace it. So some take-home messages. One is that the long-standing fish passage paradigm has failed on large Atlantic rivers. This is based on empirical data, and even if we tweak, it's not going to provide orders of magnitude differences. We've basically taken it as far as we can. Total U.S. electricity production from hydropower is rather modest. It's only about 7%. With conservation and alternative sources, we could replace it. And from a land efficiency point of view, they don't make sense given today's alternatives. Now, I am working on an interesting possible real-world application, a small river in the Northeast that I can't mention the name of right now, but because it's kind of sensitive. But we have taken climate data and used rather sophisticated models to come up with the amount of land area needed to replace 2 dams that in total produce 1.8 megawatts of power nameplate capacity, although the actual is less, and which block about 2.5 miles of river that would be open to salmon, shad, river herring, and getting them back to their historical spawning grounds. And what we found was, using this real-world data in kind of a cold climate, we found that you would need about only 1.7 acres of solar arrays to take down these 2 dams. And we believe there are near-field sites to these dams that could be used for that. And that would be a wonderful win. And I'm hoping that if this actually occurs, that it will provide a model that can be used, at least, if not for these large rivers, that I think really need help, that are going to be very controversial. On some of these smaller rivers where the dams are modest size, the electrical output is small, and where we could actually really make a difference very quickly. So, bottom line, in my opinion, is we're sacrificing the ecological health of our rivers to hydro dams when there may be a way to have both free-flowing rivers and adequate compensatory electrical generation. And I just want to get this idea out there so people start thinking a little bit more creatively about how we might actually make a meaningful difference rather than what I call this sort of cosmetic difference we have with existing fish passage. And I want to thank Karen and a number of people who have worked on this with me, and hopefully we have time for a few questions. Thank you.